Final Fantasy XIV is such an interesting game. From its inception it was met with criticism and overall derision due to its poor performance, terrible game design and gameplay. So much so that it almost ruined Square Enix as a company and forced them to completely overhaul the game under the direction of Naoki Yoshida, an employee at Square Enix who previously worked on games like Bomberman 64: The Second Attack and several Dragon Quest spin-offs. That overhaul took the form of A Realm Reborn, which, despite being completely remade with better game and world design, with a more optimised graphics engine for better performance and new art assets, was narratively a continuation of the storyline of the original, taking place 5 years after the cataclysmic events of Dalamud's destruction and Bahamut's rampage that concluded the original game. A Realm Reborn thankfully was met with a much more positive reception than its original incarnation was, and is regularly updated with large content patches that add new content such as trials, dungeons and raids, as well as more quests that continue the main scenario storyline. Realm Reborn has also received 3 large expansions thus far, each releasing within 2 years of the previous and being more popular than the last. They are Heaven's Ward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers. Shadowbringers, the latest of the game's expansions, was a huge step up in terms of quality for the game, both in terms of the quality of its main scenario narrative, as well as in terms of the world design, music and boss design. The qualities that were the highlight of A Realm Reborn were easily brought up to another level entirely in Shadowbringers. After Shadowbringers launched, Square Enix continued releasing large content patches every several months, similar to how they've been handling the previous expansions in Realm Reborn's post-game, with patch 5.1, Vows of Virtue, Deeds of Cruelty, introducing players to the first entry in Shadowbringers' 24-person Alliance raid series, YorHa Dark Apocalypse, bringing in characters, areas and music inspired by the video game Nier Automata. It also introduced the Restoration of Ishgard, a server-wide crafting and gathering challenge that has players working together to rebuild the firmament in Ishgard. This patch also continued the main scenario, showing the aftermath of the events of Shadowbringers and the party's attempts to figure out how to return to Eorzea. The following patch, 5.2 Echoes of a Fallen Star, continued in a similar fashion, adding the second tier of the Eden 8-person raid storyline, as well as the first entry in the Sorrow of Werlyt storyline, with a boss trial against a ruby weapon from Final Fantasy XIV. This patch also continued the main scenario as well, this time reintroducing the Ascian Elidibus and bringing him in direct conflict with the player character and the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. Which brings us to the latest content update for the game, titled Patch 5.3 Reflections in Crystal, which adds a plethora of new content, from a new 24-person Alliance raid titled The Puppet's Bunker, that continues the YorHa Dark Apocalypse storyline, as well as the latest chapter in the Sorrow of Werlyt storyline, which focuses on the ongoing battle between the Warrior of Light and the weapon bosses from Final Fantasy VII. Other updates include a huge overhaul of Realm Reborn's main scenario, with the storyline being adjusted to remove a lot of the padding and fetch quests that plague most of the early game, thus improving the pace of the main scenario between versions 2.0 and 2.5, as well as making every area from A Realm Reborn allow flying with mounts, so travelling across these old areas is now a lot easier and less time consuming. Additional main scenario quests were also added to conclude the current ongoing storyline, where the fate of the Scions, the Crystal Exarch, as well as Elidibus' scheme is revealed, with a new dungeon titled The Hero's Gauntlet and a new trial called the Seat of Sacrifice acting as a final boss of sorts for the Shadowbringers storyline as a whole. Aside from all of the story and raid content, there were of course the usual adjustments to certain jobs to better balance them for the current content, as well as several new weapons and attire, obtainable through new crafting recipes, or through the other new content mentioned prior. There is also a new type of boss trial called the Unreal difficulty, which once beaten allows you to play a new minigame found in Idleshire called Four Hollows, with various rewards available only through it. The Unreal trial is an item level adjusted harder version of one of the earlier boss trials introduced into the game, with the current plan being to cycle it out with another trial every large patch. The current Unreal trial is of the Akafar Amphitheatre against Realm Reborn's Shiva, though I haven't attempted it myself, so I won't be covering it in this review. A new beast tribe was also added, focusing on the dwarves. This one I haven't managed to reach yet either, as it's a crafting focused beast tribe and I haven't leveled a crafting class up to the minimum level of 70 yet to be able to access it, but from what I've seen it looks pretty cool and the rewards for doing it seem really worthwhile. There is also a plethora of new content upcoming in a few weeks' time in patch 5.35, such as the continuation of the Shadowbringers relic weapon questline and the next phase of the restoration of Ishgard, which should all give players plenty to do whilst they wait for the next big content patch. In this video though, I'm primarily going to be reviewing the new story-based content added in patch 5.3, such as the main scenario quests, YorHa Dark Apocalypse quests, and Sorrow of Werlyt quests, as well as any gameplay content attached to them such as the Hero's Gauntlet, Puppet's Bunker, etc. So yeah, suffice to say this video will be chock full of spoilers for patch 5.3, so if you haven't played it yourself or are interested in playing it, you may not want to watch this video yet. Okay, good. Alright then let's go over some of the new story content added in patch 5.3, Reflections in Crystal. The first thing I'm going to discuss is the latest update to the Sorrow of Werlyt storyline. To recap what happened prior in this storyline, the battle between the forces of the Eorzean Alliance and the Garlean Empire grows ever fiercer whilst the player character has been busy with the events of Shadowbringers, with Gaius Balsar, former antagonist who defected from the Garlean Empire after discovering the Ascians' manipulations, realising that Galmald is still working on the Ultima project, several Magitech weapons inspired by the weapon bosses from Final Fantasy XIV. One of such weapons, the Ruby weapon, was then fought by the player character in an 8-person trial, where it's revealed that the living person within the weapon can fuse with it to power it up, sacrificing themselves in the process. The living person within the Ruby weapon is discovered to be a young woman by the name of Melisandre, an orphan that Gaius had taken in and raised, devastating him. He is then confronted by several other orphans he adopted, who criticise Gaius for defecting, and it's revealed that the other orphans were chosen to pilot the other weapons. The latest update to this story focuses on the player, Gaius and Cid, travelling to the town of Turncliffe, where they confront the Sapphire Weapon, piloted by Rickon, another of Gaius's orphans. This fight however doesn't take the form of a trial like the confrontation with the Ruby weapon did. Instead it takes the form of a really cool solo duty, where the player takes control of a mech created by Cid using allagan technology to combat the weapons. The fight itself is fairly simple compared to the Ruby weapon fight, and mostly involves avoiding dodgeable attacks and using the mech's different forms optimally to take down the weapon. You might find yourself dying once or twice before you get a hang of the mechanics of the fight, as some of the AoEs and ad spawns can be a bit tricky initially to deal with, and the form changing takes some getting used to as well. It's a really cool fight though, and it's a nice change of pace from the rest of the gameplay content added in patch 5.3. After the Sapphire Weapon is defeated, Rickon is revealed to have died in the battle, furthering Gaius's motivations to stop the project before any more of his children perish. Meanwhile, a cutscene with the other orphans introduces us to a new Garlean Legatus, called Valens, a mysterious, creepy dude who berates Alphonse, one of the orphans, for letting the ruby and sapphire weapons into the hands of Cid and Gaius. The introduction for this guy really portrays him as a creepy, mysterious and uncomfortably eccentric person, with several young children attending to him, his eclectic mood swings, as well as his weird interactions with Gaius's orphan children, making for an incredibly uncomfortable final scene. Overall, the updates to this storyline in this patch were short, yet sweet. It didn't advance the Sorrow of Werlyt storyline much, but what was shown was excellently told and further fleshes out Gaius and the Gallian Empire, and sets up for more interesting plot developments in future patches. The unique duty was also really fun and is definitely going to be a huge hit with people who like mech anime, as it almost obnoxiously references Gundam at almost every moment. You even get a pretty cool Sapphire Weapon statue to place in your house or apartment to show off that you've beaten it, which is always a nice plus. Next up is the latest entry in the YorHa Dark Apocalypse storyline, which gets really heavy real quickly, and it's a real ride the entire way through. The story follows the previous parts of the storyline where Annog and Konog, the two dwarves that the player befriends, have finished rebuilding the key that 2P was looking for, whilst keeping a comatose 9S hidden from her. The storyline opens with a carnival in the Dwarven village near the dig site, complete with the amusement park music from Nier Automata, so fans of that game will definitely be able to predict that things are going to go very wrong very quickly. Whilst the carnival's occurring and all the other dwarves are acting all merry and cheery, Annog and Konog revive 2P, who immediately activates the key, causing a bunch of YorHa units to do an airstrike on the dwarf village, turning the elation and joy of the festival into a burning inferno of fear and devastation. A bunch of YorHa units then appear overlooking the village, and 2P goes to confront them, before revealing that she and the YorHa units are actually on the same side, and were created by the machine lifeforms to combat the real YorHa. "2B, the protagonist of Nier Automata, then appears to come to the dwarves' rescue, chasing off 2P and the other YorHa units to the puppet's bunker, with the player, Annog and Konog, following in pursuit. The puppet's bunker raid itself is really fun, with several boss fights, each with really interesting and enjoyable mechanics to learn and avoid. The first is a giant, almost flower-shaped robot boss that has a very unique array of attacks that will always keep you on your toes, dodging AoEs and predicting where attacks are going to hit. One attack in particular that I found quite fun to avoid was this circle AoE that expands outwards before hitting the stage with a large attack, with the only safe zones being line areas in front of sections of the circle that have gaps. The second boss fight likewise is also quite fun, with each alliance splitting off to deal with their own YorHa unit. This fight has some really fun attack patterns, though some are a lot harder than the previous bosses to avoid, even if you do know the patterns. Occasionally each of the bosses in the fight will team up to do a fairly predictable attack pattern that, once you know how it works, isn't too tricky to avoid, yet is still quite entertaining to witness. The third boss is probably my least favourite of the bunch, though it's not bad, just a bit bland compared to the others. You face off against a quadrupedal mech that has various lasers, AoEs and other such attacks that can all deal a lot of damage. There are also several attacks that come from the walls and from the centre of the battle area, which can lead to some hectic moments, though some of the attacks are very tricky to avoid even if you know how to handle them, due to how large some of them can be. Before I talk about the final boss though, I have to say that the location design of the puppet's bunker is really cool as well, with the theming being based around a replica of the moon bunker that the YorHa units are based in from Nier Automata. As such, you'll be running along the exterior to find a way in, then running through familiar hallways including 2B's room and exploring the operations room before heading to the hangar and boarding the alien ship to face off against the final boss. The music in the raid is as expected considering the quality of the Nier soundtrack, phenomenal with some really great and unique song choices for each boss fight and whilst running through the hallways of the bunker. Honestly, the music alone is powerful enough to make any of these bosses feel a lot cooler and fun than they already are. The final boss of the raid is really cool yet really weird, with the introduction cutscene showing 2B defeating 2P, who quickly turns into a bunch of weird blank mannequins who join together to form a giant disgusting orb, similar to Legion from the Castlevania series. Though it's a fairly easy and quick fight with only 3 very blatantly telegraphed attack patterns that are fairly easy to avoid. This is just the first phase of the final boss fight however, as once you defeat the orb it collapses and the mannequins rejoin to form a giant version of 2P, as an incredible medley remix of the iconic Final Fantasy XIV battle music, torn from the heavens, and the Nier track, The Dark Colossus Destroys All, plays in the background. Honestly, the music is part of what makes the final boss of this raid so brilliant, as it's very grandiose and epic, and makes this fight against a giant 2P all the more intense. The boss fight itself is really fun, with 2P having several different attacks that all offer a decent challenge, and I've got to say, the party I was with wiped constantly for the first couple of tries. It was quite a challenge. The rewards for the raid are decent, with the orchestrion rolls, 2P and 2B minions, and triple triad cards being really great rewards, though admittedly I personally haven't obtained any of them yet because my luck is absolutely awful. The gear that drops throughout the raid is alright as well, though aesthetically it all feels a bit uninteresting compared to the gear from the copied factory sets. And I've run the raid about 4 or 5 times now and I haven't seen a single piece of Dragoon armor drop yet, which made me more than a little salty. My personal gripes about my dire luck aside, the Puppet's Bunker raid is one of the best 24-person alliance raids in the game so far, and is a real joy to run through. After the raid, the storyline continues with 2B reuniting and leaving with a comatose 9S, whom Zanog and Konog have kept safe and hidden. Meanwhile, Annog battles the guilt felt from helping 2P, which is further impacted by the other dwarves blaming her and Konog for the devastation caused by the machine lifeforms. Where the story goes from here, I have no clue, but what I can say is that I'm excited to see what they do for the final Alliance raid in the series and how they conclude the storyline, as it's all been incredibly good so far and I can see it only getting better. The raid was fun and exciting and I'm definitely going to enjoy doing multiple runs of it to get all the loot from it, and the new story beats were all pretty interesting with plenty of twists and turns along the way. Now on to the core meat of the new content added in patch 5.3, the new main scenario content. The new story chapters were fairly hyped up before the launch as the conclusion to Shadowbringers' main scenario, focusing on the final confrontation with the Ascian Elidibus and the fate of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. To recap what happened prior to the events of this patch, after the events of the main Shadowbringers expansion, the Scions of the Seventh Dawn and the Crystal Exarch attempt to figure out a way to return the Scions to their bodies in the Source, as they are starting to feel severe etherical instability due to their souls being transported and manifesting in the First. Meanwhile, The last of the unsundered Ascians, Elidibus, makes a return after Xenos reclaimed his body that was being possessed by him during the post-Stormblood and Shadowbringers scenario. This time Elidibus has taken the form of Ardbert, the version of the Warrior of Light from the first, whose appearance immediately sets off all kinds of red flags to the player, since the player merged with Ardbert during the climax of the Shadowbringers expansion, so he shouldn't be there. It's quickly established that Elidibus is trying to encourage the people of the First into becoming Warriors of Light themselves, with some of them even receiving the power of the Echo, with the purpose being unclear. Now here we are with patch 5.3, where we get some interesting scenes between Elidibus and the player character, where he decries you for killing Lahabrea and Emmett Selk, in a cool solo duty in Amarot, where he basically recaps the entire story of the game up until that point, culminating in a fight against Ardbert Elidibus. Afterwards, you discover a set of crystals that represent all the different members of the Convocation of the 14th, and you learn more about the 14th member that the player character and Ardbert were the sundered fragments of. Elidibus then reveals his ultimate goal and plan, that being to commandeer the Crystal Tower and summon spectres of Warriors of Lights from other worlds to kill the player and the Scions. The player and the Scions then rush back to Crystarium to confront Elidibus in one final battle, but the airship they were taking crashes in Armorang, where they are thrust into a new story dungeon, the Hero's Gauntlet, to attempt to reach the Crystal Tower on foot. The Hero's Gauntlet is a really fun dungeon that has you exploring areas of Armorang, Ilmeg and Lakeland on your journey back to the Crystarium, really making it feel like a round trip of some of Shadowbringers' key locations, fighting off spectres of Warriors of Light along the way. The bosses are all interesting and have unique attacks that, again, like a lot of the other fights added in this patch, all feel quite different to anything prior to it. The boss designs are also really cool, the first being a spectral thief, who darts around quickly, leading to some fast-paced attacks and mechanics. The second boss, the Spectral Necromancer, is similarly challenging and fun, though a little bit more technical with its mechanics than the Thief, opting to summoning zombies that chase and latch onto players to stun them and make them vulnerable to AoE attacks. The final boss of the dungeon, the Spectral Berserker, is really cool, with several unique attacks, such as one where you have to stack with piles of rubble instead of the rest of your party, as well as one where you have to run into a hole the boss made in the ground to avoid a cleave attack. The music in the dungeon is also really fun, taking several melodies and key motifs from various areas of tracks from Shadowbringers to really drive home the feeling that it's a world tour of sorts of each of the locations in Northrend. The gear set you can obtain in this dungeon looks really good for most of the classes, in particular the maiming and striking sets look awesome, in my opinion, and I can't wait to get the full set for my Dragoon. Overall, this dungeon is probably the best of the post-Shadowbringer dungeons, purely because the theming and boss mechanics are all pretty solid. The music too really helps to elevate it all as well, and it just feels really great, at least on your first run through. Like all expert roulette dungeons, it will probably get kinda tiring after your 10th run through, but that's probably more due to the fact that the expert roulette only ever has 2 dungeons in its rotation at a time. After the dungeon, the players run onwards to the Crystal Tower, while the Scions hold back the Spectral Horde, meeting up with the Crystal Exarch on the way, who explains how Elidibus has taken over the tower and that his summonings are taking a serious effect on the Exarch's body due to the Exarch's unique connection to the tower. Therefore, the Exarch joins the player on their journey to the Crystarium, where they inevitably confront Elidibus, who transforms into the Warrior of Light from Final Fantasy I in an excellent culmination to this game's narrative. Oh boy, the Seat of Sacrifice trial. Where do I begin? It's such a good fight on so many levels. Firstly, the design of the boss itself is pretty much just the Warrior of Light from Final Fantasy I, which in itself makes the fight feel even more climactic as the concluding fight for the Shadowbringers storyline, because it feels like it brings everything round full circle. Secondly, the music is absolutely brilliant. The song that plays during the trial is called To the Edge, and it's a very good rock and vocal version of the Amarok theme, with elements of the track Shadowbringers peppered in to really hammer home the emotional weight of the track. Finally, narrative-wise, it's just very climactic, as it very much feels like the conclusion to everything 14 has been building up to, due to it being the final fight against the last remaining unsundered Ascian, who has been a thorn in the player's side all the way since A Realm Reborn. It very much feels like the payoff to 7 years of story, and it's just a very satisfying fight purely because of that. In terms of gameplay, the fight itself is also just really cool, with several interesting and fun attack patterns, such as one where Elidibus draws a triangle across a large portion of the battle area, killing anyone caught in it. There is also a surprisingly difficult button mashy quicktime event halfway through, where Elidibus attempts to send you and the other players into a void dimension, until you are summoned back by the spirit of En itself in a really cool scene, where you also learn the name of the sundered Ascian that became the player in Ardbert, the Traveller Azem. The fight then ramps up, with Elidibus limit breaking and summoning several spectres of other warriors of light from other dimensions. Handling each of the warrior's attack mechanics isn't too difficult, but also damaging Elidibus and avoiding his attacks at the same time makes it quite tricky, at least initially when you're first learning the mechanics. I haven't yet attempted the extreme difficulty version of the trial, but I can imagine it will be more than likely quite the challenge for anyone who attempts it, regardless of skill level, as I bet some of the harder versions of his moveset are going to be quite a pain to handle. The fight ends with the Crystal Exarch showing up and helping the player defeat Elidibus, who disappears after a touching cutscene where he laments the passing of his friends and brothers.
Reconciliation. Elidibus. I was needed. I withdrew myself from Zodiark for them. My people. My brothers. My friends. Stay strong. Keep the faith. At duty's end, we will meet again. We will. We will. The rains have ceased, and we have been graced with another beautiful day. But you are not here to see it.
The Crystal Exarch then bestows the player with one of the crystals he had prepared to convert the souls of the other Scions into, in order to get them back into their bodies in the source. The Exarch then turns to crystal, the effects of the tower finally taking its toll on him. Then follows a couple quests where the Scions say goodbye to the friends and allies they made during their stay in Northrend, before transferring their souls into the other crystals the Exarch had made for them. The player then takes the crystals back to the source, where Cryo and Tataru help transfer the souls from the crystals into their original bodies, and the Scions wake up happy and healthy. A cutscene then plays, showing the player character rushing to the version of the Crystal Tower in the source, where a younger YorHa Tyr is slumbering, and transfers the soul and memories of the Exarch from the first into his younger body, via the crystal that the Exarch gave to the player in their final moments. An epilogue of sorts shows the Scions recovering quite well from their ordeal, with Tataru, with help from Theo Ul, crafting copies of the Scions' Shadowbringers attire for them to wear, before the player and a recovered YorHa Tyr join the party, with the latter accepting an invitation to become a member of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. The jolly epilogue doesn't last long, however, as the scene suddenly shifts to Xenos sitting on his throne in Garmald, surrounded by several corpses. A mysterious Ascian then appears and celebrates the fact that the last of the unsundered Ascians have passed, and that he and Xenos now have free reign to do whatever they want. This Ascian reveals himself to be called Fandaniel, who has taken on the appearance of everyone's least favourite character, Asahi Thus Brutus. The main scenario so far ends with Fandaniel stating that he is leaving to set up Xenos' hunting ground, whilst Xenos himself mutters that soon he'll face the player once again, as the player is the only warrior strong enough and interesting enough to challenge him. Honestly, the main scenario quests added in patch 5.3 were altogether an incredible experience, and further exemplifies just how good the entire Shadowbringers scenario is as a package. It's an incredibly emotional story with an absolutely incredible soundtrack, great cinematography and animation work, especially for an MMO, and the gameplay in between cutscenes works in tandem with the story perfectly. I also have to give major props to the voice acting in the English dub of the game, in particular the actors who voiced Elidibus and the Crystal Exarch Grahatir, as they did an absolutely phenomenal job with their roles, and you can really feel the emotional range of the characters through their voices, and it just really makes the dialogue all the more greater for it.
Into its domain shall the hero set forth, for the final chapter in the tale of this star.
The level of quality the developers displayed during the main scenario quests in this patch is very commendable, and as such, I'm excited to see what comes next. Though, I will be honest, the prospect of facing off against Xenos again as a main antagonist doesn't really interest me that much. Then again, before Shadowbringers I thought the Ascians were all boring, lame, cookie-cutter villains anyway, but Shadowbringers proved that the writers can turn bland, uninteresting characters into some of the best, so here's hoping they can work their magic on Fandaniel and Xenos to make them interesting and compelling antagonists going forward. All in all, patch 5.3 Reflections in Crystal is one of the absolute best patches to ever be released for Final Fantasy XIV. The story content, whether the main scenario, the YorHa storyline, or through the Sorrow of Werlyt trial questline, is all brilliantly told, with brilliant cinematic cutscenes, superb music, and some deeply emotional moments that really exemplify just why Final Fantasy XIV is one of, if not the best, MMORPG on the market currently. Not just from a storytelling perspective either, because all of the gameplay content included in the patch, whether it's the stuff I talked about in depth in this video like the new dungeons, raids, trials and solo duties, or the stuff I haven't really talked about, such as the crafting beast tribe with the dwarves, the new custom delivery vendors, or the Realm Reborn enhancements, no matter what, it's all really damn solidly made, with excellently designed battles that offer a decent challenge, yet not without tons of spectacle and wonder, as well as great cosmetic and practical rewards that make you really feel like what you're doing is worth it. As such, I highly recommend, if you haven't done any of the content I've mentioned in this video yet, but still watched through to this point, go do it, you won't regret it, as it's all really quite spectacular. And if you haven't played Final Fantasy XIV yet and are looking to give it a try, now's the best time, as the free trial has been permanently extended to allow you to play for free up to level 60 and towards the end of the Heavensward expansion content. That's all the time we have for today. I hope I managed to convey just how much I enjoyed Final Fantasy XIV patch 5.3, Reflections in Crystal, and why Final Fantasy XIV continues to excel in all areas. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more videos. and comment below with your thoughts on this video and off patch 5.3. I'm interested in hearing what you all think. Until next time though, this has been Kingdom H, and thanks for watching.